everyone, and welcome to this wonderful new edition in strategy into performance management with technology on Amoge Radio Communications. The second Monday of August 2025, Monday, August 11, 2025. My name is Charles. What a joy, what a delight, what a pleasure to have you with us. We are very, very grateful for the privilege of your continuing presence, even as we continue to explore this deep, broad, and very critical topic, translating strategy into performance management. That has been the theme of our program since the beginning of this quarter, and today we are very grateful to be getting to episode 5. As we usually do, we are going to start by doing a quick recap of some of the highlights of last week's program. But first of all, again, we want to say, how are you doing? Hope you had a restful weekend. Hope you've had a progressive month thus far, and hope you're taking time to implement some of the things you're learning from this program. I must be honest with you, the things you're getting from this program are very, very valuable. I was listening to it to the last episode, and I said to myself, oh my God, I wish they knew how many thousands of dollars we would charge to bring them to a class to learn this. This is very, very valuable, and it's coming from about 2 decades of experience, of practical experience, translating strategy into performance management, and we are very, very grateful to share it with you, grateful for the opportunity to share it with you, but we also want you to understand that it is very valuable, and what is going to bring the value we are expecting is when you begin to implement the principles there. You evaluate yourself as an organization to start with, vis-a-vis the principles you're learning, see where you are, see where you're lacking, and then you begin to practice the last week's episode. So last week we had looked at monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management for strategic accountability. I'll say that again, monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services for strategic accountability. It was a very loaded episode, like I said, and I want to encourage everyone who didn't have the opportunity to join to please go back to and listen to last week's episode. Share with someone. And of course, if you are yet to subscribe, please subscribe to Amoge Radio Communications YouTube page and invite someone to do so. Now, when we said last week that monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services is something to be achieved using performance management for strategic accountability, especially the performance monitoring part of performance management, we're saying essentially that we would be discussing the monitoring imperative, because monitoring is an imperative, right? We also said we're going to talk about the different types of measures to emphasize. We're going to highlight some of the different types of measures to emphasize, right? We said last week that since the whole at the minimum should be equal to the sum of the parts, when you're monitoring the implementation of strategic goals of the organization, you should be equivalent to different managers at different levels monitoring the execution of the performance objectives of different levels of the organization, because the performance objectives of the different roles in the organization should culminate into the strategic goals of the organization. In other words, if the strategic goals of the organization have been broken down into the performance objectives of different roles within the organization, then monitoring the performance of the different roles in the organization, in other words, comparing their performance plans with their actual performance implementation in the course of the performance period, is equal to comparing the performance of the organization vis-a-vis the strategic goals of the organization for that strategic period. So if you're talking about monitoring the performance plans of the different roles in the organization, putting in place an effective system for performance monitoring as a subset of performance management, you are automatically implementing, instituting, establishing an effective process for monitoring the implementation of the organization's strategic objectives. Let me put it another way that is even more hopefully punchy. If you are not monitoring the performance implementation of different roles of the organization vis-a-vis the performance goals set for them, right, based on their performance plans at the beginning of the performance period, you are essentially failing to monitor the implementation of the strategic objectives of the organization. And at the end of that period, you are going to find out that there is likely to be a significant gap between the strategy and implementation at the level of the organization. So there is no how you can be failing, and performance monitoring is an imperative. There is no other way around it, right? We try to emphasize that point last week. So monitoring the performance of the different roles in the organization should be tantamount to monitoring the implementation of the strategic goals of the organization, especially if they have gone through the PI part of the Amogate Primer cycle. Remember, Amogate Strategic Management Primer cycle, where P stands for planning, I stands for implementation, M stands for monitoring, A stands for assessment, and R stands for revision, right? So if you have gone through the PI part of that cycle, that's the planning and implementation, right, and ensure that you also effectively connected it to the PE part of Amogate's PIMA performance management cycle, where P also stands for planning and contracting, E stands for execution, M stands for monitoring and coaching, A stands for assessment, and R stands for rewards and consequences. So if you have effectively connected the planning and implementation of your strategy to the planning and implementation of performance, right, at the level of the different roles, then monitoring the implementation of the performance goals of the different roles in the organization will be tantamount to monitoring the implementation of the strategic goals of the organization. In other words, the strategic planning phase of the strategic management cycle should have been well connected to the performance monitoring phase of the performance management cycle, and the implementation of the PIMA cycle would also be connected to the execution of the strategy at the organizational level, right? So the execution at the level of different roles would be delivering the execution or the implementation of the overall organizational cycle. Now, like we said, if this has happened, if you have connected those strategic plans to performance plans, and you have connected strategy implementation, performance and execution at the top and lower level organizations, then when you begin to monitor the execution of the performance objectives of the different levels of the organization, it should be equivalent to and culminating into monitoring the performance of the organization in the different strategic goals. Now, from there we went on to the types of measures to emphasize. You said anytime you talk about strategic, remember you're talking about being discriminatory. Very, very important. To be strategic is to be discriminatory. So when we say you are setting strategic goals, we're essentially saying that you have to discriminate against certain things that are not as strategic as other things you would choose to focus on. Now, bringing this down to performance monitoring, you must identify the strategic priorities in the planning process, right? Because you cannot give equal attention to everything, like we said. And then when, as an organization, as a department, as a unit, as a manager, setting goals for different roles, if you have implemented this principle of strategic prioritization, when you now come to performance monitoring, when you come to the measures, right? Remember, we're talking about the types of measures to emphasize. When it comes to the measures, you want to also be strategically discriminatory. You are going to be discriminating against 80% of measures using the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule that says 20% of elements will usually give you 80% of results. So you want to be discriminating against the 80% of elements that will not give you the maximum output, right? The 80% that would essentially, if you're not careful, only give you 20% of results. So you want to discriminate against those 80% of measures to identify the 20% of measures that will deliver the 80% results. So the process of being strategic with performance measures is going through the data, going through the analysis, going through the forecasting, going through the environmental scanning, going through the internal assessment, and doing all of that data gathering analysis to be able to determine what you should focus most of your performance monitoring resources on, in order to ensure that you are targeting the performance monitoring resources, right, at the most critical areas, activities that will deliver the maximum output. Not just for the maximum output, but also the maximum output and impact. This is extremely important, right? So if you have done all of that, then the measures you are going to use as the basis for monitoring are going to be targeted at the key performance areas, or the key performance indicators depending on the level of the organizational structure, and they would likely deliver the maximum impact, output, and outcomes. Really, really important, right? So these measures those strategic measures are what you want to be focusing on in monitoring. Again, we need to emphasize this, that you want to make sure that you're focusing the performance monitoring resources in terms of time, in terms of attention, you're on the most strategic measures which should have been identified at the level of planning, right? And we also try to zoom in on some of those types of measures. It could be service quality, it could be timeliness, it could be customer satisfaction. We try to share some of those things, and we of course re-emphasize the point that it is very important to make the connection between the measures being focused upon and the strategic priorities of the organization. This is how you use performance management for strategic accountability. The things that the organization has committed to and will be accountable for are those things you want to be monitoring at the level of different goals in terms of the execution of the performance goals. So in summary, monitoring enables, facilitates, and increases the chances of implementation significantly, but you must be monitoring based on measures that have been strategically selected to align with the strategic priorities, which should have been translated into performance plans. That's a very quick recap of last week's very deep and broad session. Now we're moving on from there to using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring. I'm going to say that again. Using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring. Remember, we said in closing last week that you had to remember to be strategic in your monitoring and to become optimal in the use of your monitoring resources, right? That was our closing shot, our parting shot. So remember to be strategic in your monitoring and to become optimal in the use of monitoring resources. But how then do you become, as strategic as possible in performance monitoring? This is where technology comes in. So this week we're going to be looking at using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring. We're glad to have you on this edition of the program. We're very grateful for the privilege of your presence, and we want to continue to look at certain things that are important, right, when it comes to using performance management to enable the implementation of strategy at the organizational level. And we've been looking at performance monitoring, and now we're talking about using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring, as we used the whole of last week to establish that it's very important to be strategic in performance monitoring. Now, like we always say on this program, technology is not going to do the thinking for you. Technology is going to only enable what you have put in place. Technology is going to accelerate what you have established. Technology is going to, simplify. Technology is going to, optimize. But technology is not going to put certain frameworks in place for you. So remember, when you're using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring, you must have put your performance monitoring process in place, like we've spent the whole of last week talking about, so we're not going to repeat that. The performance monitoring process begins with the performance goals. It also begins with defining your performance measures. Those performance measures are spelled out in both quantitative and qualitative terms, right? Now, how do you use technology to become strategic in those performance monitoring activities after you have set your performance monitoring framework in place as a subset of the performance management process? The first thing again begins with creating that framework, that performance monitoring sub-framework, as a part of your entire performance management framework. Now, let me speak a little bit hypothetically. Just imagine that you had a dashboard, right? And that's the technology coming in to enable certain things. Now, on that dashboard, imagine that you have your performance measures, right, for different roles, right, and different goals, because each role will have different goals. And like we always try to emphasize, it's important to be as strategic as possible, even in choosing the goals for each role, so that they can be truly strategic and they can be focused and prioritize resources in the limited time available. Time is always a limited resource, so you have to optimize it. So let's imagine that you have, for instance, 4 key goals, right, for a particular role. Now, each of those 4 key goals should have the performance measures well defined, right, explicitly defined. Now, those performance measures should also have, for instance, a start point, a midpoint, and an end point, right? The start point there, of course, being the beginning of the period, right? At this point, this is where this role is in this area. But by the middle of the performance period, if the performance period is, for instance, a year, by mid-year, or if the period is half year, then by the end of the first quarter, this is where you are expecting that role to be, the occupier of that role to have been with respect to that particular measure. So if you have your start point, you have your midpoint, and you should also have the end point. For instance, if you see on a particular role that you want to see increase customer satisfaction by, for instance, 20% in the performance period, right? At the beginning, the customer satisfaction score was probably 2%. Let's say the performance satisfaction score in the organization was quite poor at the beginning, and it was probably just 20% at the beginning. And you say, okay, at the minimum, this performance satisfaction score over this period should have increased, for instance, by 50% because it's really poor. So you want to see performance satisfaction score go from 20% to 30% over a given period, right? And so at the beginning, the start point was 20%. By midway into that performance period, you expect the the customer satisfaction score to have improved by, say, 5%, because improving it by 20% is going from 20 to 30% by the end of the period, and that means you're going by 10%. So at the beginning, you are 20. At the minimum, you want to see a 5% improvement midway, and then at the end of the performance period, you want to see 30%. You want to see 30% score, which means there will have been a 10% improvement. Once you define that, the dashboard should show you where you are, right, in midway. And the dashboard, the technology should be enabled to also flag when there is a significant departure, by midway from the goals that have been set, from the metrics and the measures that you are expecting, or where you're expected to have reached in those measures, right? So technology should be used to flag significant departures. Technology should also be used to flag areas where, for instance, there are significant departures across the organization. A particular role will be struggling with one area, but if many roles across the organization are lagging in the same performance theme, for instance, then you really want to be sure that you are not doing something wrong at the organizational level. So there's another thing that technology should be flagging for you, right? This is using technology to enable performance monitoring. Remember, we're talking about using technology to enable performance monitoring, but of course, you have to have your framework in place before you can use technology to become strategic in your performance monitoring. Now, to become strategic in performance monitoring, again, we'll keep emphasizing, has to do with, first of all, defining the critical measures, the key performance measures, right? You want to focus on. Now, different performance monitoring systems can be tailored, especially in terms of the application of those performance monitoring systems. They can be tailored to serve different defined purposes, right? So once you have defined the purpose, especially of a given period of you as an organization, then you want to ensure you are building a performance monitoring system that is targeted at enabling your purpose, right? So now those purposes can be defined in terms of, for instance, one, the kind of measures you want to track. That can be the purpose of a performance monitoring system. You could say, you know what, it is very important for us to track these kind of measures. I just give an example. Customer satisfaction is a critical determinant of success and sustainability in this industry, right? You could look at it and say, this industry, the products are very similar, but where we can differentiate is in terms of service, right? If we can give differentiated service, then we are likely to perform significantly better than our competitors. Then you want to make sure that you are targeting your performance monitoring system at that particular measure that you want to track. For another organization, you say, no, in my own industry, maybe you're in the healthcare industry, quality is a sine qua non for success. I have to make sure that there is uncompromisable quality, not just uncompromising quality, which is just at one point in time, but uncompromisable quality, which is that at every point in time there must be a continuous compliance with quality. We cannot afford to sleep, SLIP, in terms of quality, right? So we want to make sure there that For instance, the percentage of your products that are adhering to stipulated standards is 101% if possible. So if you set that as a goal, like 100% compliance, if you ask me, if you really want to beat the standard, right, you want to exceed the standard, but minimum of 100% compliance with stipulated standards, right? So in that case, product quality, becomes a critical measure, right? So what the technology does is that even in terms of, especially when it comes to the front end part of the technology, the pathway that interfaces with the user, you want to draw a lot of attention, maybe using colors, maybe using font size, maybe using italics, bold. You want to draw a lot of attention to those key performance areas, the kinds of measures that you have already defined as critical for you as an organization and that period, right? This is still Tolu Omodara here on Amoge Radio Communications. This beautiful Monday. We're still looking at our theme for the quarter, translating strategy into performance management with technology. And then this week specifically, we are looking at using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring. I repeat, using technology to become strategic with performance monitoring. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Harrogate, founded in 2008 out of a desire to build transgenerational structures for organizations, institutions, and nations. We have worked with large businesses, international development organizations, and public sector ministries and agencies. Harrogate, our uniqueness is that we do not just work for you, we work with you. For example, we do not leave you to the task after sourcing talent, but we help the new hire settle into robust leadership development programs. We are technical experts in advising and supporting institutions on strategy and leadership, artificial intelligence, strategic human resource management, public sector reform, finance, audit and tax, FAT, and strategic communications. We do all this and more out of a desire to transform nations through institutions and organizations. For further inquiries, email contact at thearmorgate.org or call +234 810 999 6666 +234 807 957 4151 and +161 0504 6026 www.thearmorgate.org. Armorgate, building to endure and transforming nations through institutions and organizations.
Welcome back. This is still Amoge Radio Communications. My name is Tolu Omodara, and we are looking at translating strategy into performance management using technology. And the focus again is using technology. Focus for this week is using technology to become strategic with performance monitoring. Right now, let's continue. So we're talking about one of the areas that technology can enable strategic performance monitoring. Being emphasizing the focus measures, right? We can also use technology to become strategic in performance monitoring with regards to the reporting frequencies. The reporting frequencies, again, this has to be discriminatory, right? Because sometimes you do not essentially want to, be monitoring everything at the same level of frequency. Very, very important, right? You don't want to. If you're being truly strategic, then there are certain things you probably want to increase the reporting frequencies of certain measures, right? Especially those ones that you want to draw attention to, and you may not necessarily need to monitor certain other metrics till the end of the period, right? Maybe you want to discuss that with your direct report only at the end of the performance period, whether it's 3 months or 6 months, as the case may be. But there are certain ones you want to be monitoring, right? Either at the level of the self or at the level of the manager. You want to ensure that, in other words, you should be doing your own self performance monitoring, right? And you should also definitely be monitoring the performance of your direct reports. So the reporting frequencies for those performance measures that are defined as critical, the key performance measures, right, the ones that are most strategic, should definitely be higher, and technology will enable that. So if, for instance, you can set reminders to check where your direct reports and you yourself are in those performance measures, how well you have progressed from the baseline and how much you are moving towards the midline if you're in the earlier part of the performance period, or how well you're progressing from the midline to the end line if you're in the latter part of the performance period, right? So you should definitely use technology to increase the reporting frequencies of the more strategic performance metrics, right? And that is something that can be an enabler again for performance monitoring. When you get those reminders, for instance, maybe bi-weekly, that's fortnightly, or maybe you even want to get it daily, or you want to get it monthly, depending on what is workable. But definitely you can also use technology to increase reporting frequencies for the more strategic performance metrics. Another thing you can do when it comes to using technology to become strategic in performance monitoring is you can also use technology to define the audiences where you want the data to be shared with, right? Like I said earlier, sometimes you want to share it with yourself because you're doing your own self-monitoring. But if you're doing peer monitoring, for instance, maybe as a team, maybe as an organization, there are certain things you want to hold yourself accountable for, so there's peer accountability. You also want to make sure that those metrics, especially where you are at different points of the performance period in terms of progress towards the set goals, right, towards the set measure, you also want to ensure that those who are stakeholders, for instance, the peer mentoring, wants to make sure that those peers to whom you are accountable, hopefully mutually accountable, are also getting that data, and technology can be used to set that, either as an email or either as a flash on their own screen, especially when you're using a software like ASF, the Analytics Strategy Articulation Implementation Framework software, right? There'll be different visions, different screens, different dashboards for different roles in the organization. But definitely technology can be used to determine the audiences that you want that data shared with. And I'm talking about the progress data now, the monitoring data, because you're monitoring to take action before the end of the performance period, right? So there you need to be sharing the progress data, where you are vis-a-vis where you should be, how far you are from where you should be. That data is something that technology can be used to direct at the right audience, at the appropriate audience. And of course, you can also use technology to define the kind of factors that you want to emphasize, right? And I like what I mean by that, because even though you have different metrics, remember that's largely the quantitative part of the data. There is also the qualitative part of the data, right? And we've kept emphasizing that you must have both quantitative and qualitative metrics. So the qualitative part of the data is more likely to speak to the, for instance, the why, and maybe each time is a score, or each time a numerical element is entered, maybe in percentage, maybe in numbers. The quantitative element is entered maybe in percentage, maybe in numbers, to show comparisons for performance monitoring. There should also be an explanation, and if certain things, for instance, certain themes are recurring in the explanation on the qualitative aspect, you probably also want to flag it. Like I said, for instance, that which is probably occurring excessively in the organization. But if, for instance, you don't want to hear things like manager ineffectiveness, if you ask someone to say, why didn't you do all of this for self-monitoring, and the person says, well, lack of manager support, right? Now, if only 20% of your organization is saying that, maybe it's not so much of a challenge, but maybe by the time you have 40 to 50% of your organization complaining about lack of manager support, then you probably know that you want to do more to coach your managers on, for instance, performance coaching, right? Because it's not a given. We said that about 2 or 3 episodes ago. You also want to make sure that your managers know how to do performance coaching. Monitoring is not just about monitoring, but it's also about coaching. So the technology can be used to flag excessive occurrence, right? Once again, technology will first be used to define the bar, more like the minimum number of instances you want to see direct reports highlighting lack of manager support or inadequate performance coaching as the reason for their non-performance or their inadequate performance or their insufficient performance. But once you have more than a certain number of direct reports complaining about the kind of performance coaching and attributing their lack of performance or poor performance or suboptimal performance to poor coaching by the managers, the technology can be used to flag such things so that as an organization you can quickly pick on it and you can quickly begin to address it. Wow. I think this is how far we are going to be able to go this week on using technology to enable performance monitoring. But just know as we wrap up for this week that what is important is to define those performance measures, to define what you want to achieve with performance, especially the key performance measures you want to focus on. Then you want to ensure that you're using technology to become as strategic as possible with performance monitoring, because you cannot monitor everything at the same level. There are certain measures you want to focus more on. There are certain audiences, right, that you want to share more of the performance monitoring information with, right? Whether it's managers, whether it's peer, whether it's even sometimes your downlines as well. Maybe they have responsibility for flagging certain things to you as a manager. If even you are for instance, so to say, you are lagging in those areas. Maybe for instance your executive assistant, you want him or her to flag those things to you, then he or she will become, he or she may become one of the audiences that you want to share that performance monitoring information with. And those are the kind of things that you can use technology to achieve in your strategic monitoring of performance. Well, this is how far I think we're going to come on today's edition of the program, using strategies to enable performance monitoring, strategic performance monitoring, not just using technology to enable strategic performance monitoring, not just monitoring, but strategic performance monitoring. We're going to be back same time, same station next week by God's grace as we continue to explore this topic, translating strategy into performance with technology. But until then, we want you to remember these are things to implement, and we're here to work with you, we're here to support you. It's Communications Consults, an organization that has close to 2 decades of experience in these principles that we're sharing with you. We've worked with supranationals, we've worked with organizations, we've worked with public sector organizations, private sector organizations, and we are very good at what we do. By the grace of God, we work internationally, and we've also worked across different levels of the organization. We can help you articulate your strategy, translate its performance goals, build performance frameworks, ensure that the performance monitoring substructure, all the performance frameworks are effective and responsive. Not just effective but also responsive, because the whole point of performance monitoring is responsiveness, and ultimately all of this helps to ensure that your strategic goals are achieved as an organization and you're not just successful but also building a sustainable institution. Thank you very much again. We'll be back same time, same station next week. Until then, I remain your role model. And remember, don't just monitor your performance, be strategic with your performance monitoring. I'll see you next week, and until then, have a good one.